What's going on, traders? Welcome back to another video. Today I'm talking trend lines, and this is a very, very interesting topic. It's something I get asked all the time. How do you trade profitably with trend lines? Well, in today's video, I'm going to talk about a little bit some strategies, some concepts that I like using when talking about trend lines. I actually love trend lines, and they're one of my favorite technical indicators or technical kind of price action tools that you can use to try and find setups in the market. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to break down some simple concepts that you can use, how to draw effective trend lines, as well as some strategies that you can use them with. Let's jump into it right now. All right, traders, so I'm here on the charts. I'm going to pull it up on my screen here, and what we'll do is we'll take a look at AUD Swiss right now. This is Aussie Swiss, and I have an example pulled up. Now, I know that this is going to be a cookie cutter perfect example for the video. Bear with me. I'm trying to make an example out of this so that we can hopefully get something out of this. Now, when I'm talking about a trend line, there's some things that people get lost along the way on. They get confused, they get tricked up about trend lines, and there's definitely a subjective nature to them. What I mean by that is people are going to draw trend lines differently. So we're looking here at the chart. Some people might draw strictly along the lows or the highs of a move, right? Which would give you something like this, right? We're using the lows, the lows, the lows, right? If we wanted to draw that, well, we could draw trend lines across the highs, right? Which would give you something like this, right? There's different ways to draw trend lines. So what actually ends up happening is people get stuck because they get so caught up in drawing the perfect trend line that they kind of draw it, they try and come up with a definition that's perfect, but there is no perfect definition to trend lines, right? So you have people who draw them along the highs, along the closes, along the line of best fit. And my personal approach is going to be the final one, which is drawing lines or trend lines across the line of best fit across a market, or at least one that kind of captures closest to the closes of line of best fit. So I'll give you an example. Here on Aussie Swiss, you can see if I were to erase this trend line here and start over, basically what I've done is I've started at the bottom of this trend here, and I've drawn a line that encompasses kind of a couple of these major moves. So if we kind of look here just at the beginning, right, this is where I drew my line. We've got prices around the lows here, the lows here, and the lows here. And this kind of gives me a general direction or a general idea. And that's really the biggest component I want to hit on with trend lines, is this is a general trend direction line. It's not a perfect entry point. It's not a magical perfection, pinpoint price where everything is going to go right if you get in. It's just a general level of price demand, right? It's basically, think of like a support or resistance level where it's a horizontal level of supply and demand. Like, for example, we'll go ahead and draw an example here, right? You've got a horizontal level of resistance. It's very kind of straightforward. In fact, in this case, you can see what was a resistance point ended up becoming a supportive level when we broke up. Okay, simple enough. Well, trend lines can be tricky to people because trend lines are a dynamic or a diagonal level of support or resistance, and that's why they're a little bit more subjective depending on how you draw them. So now that we have a general idea, okay, draw a line of best fit, at least that's my personal approach, right? This gives us this general point of view, okay? Well, now that we have that, now that we understand that, okay, trend lines are generally a directional kind of tool, now what do we do with it? How can we trade them? How can we set up, alerts or setups that would give us some sort of an edge? Well, in this example, when we're taking a look at Aussie Swiss, we have a market that's moving to the upside, finding demand along this trend line. Well, as we go along, right, we've got our trend line here. As we've got this trend line in mind, if we see something like this, where we see, okay, resistance here, we start to see a pullback, but this trend line has been in favor, this is where we can look for potential setups. Okay, so we're using that trend line. I usually look for at least 2 to 3 bounces, preferably 3 bounces off of a trend line for me to consider it. What I mean by that is, take a look here. I'll redraw this trend line one more time. So we have one bounce here. We have a second bounce in this area, and we have a third bounce in here. And now I can extend that out a little bit to get an idea of where this trend line might reside. Okay, so we have this kind of, we've drawn 1, 2, 3, right? And we have our trend line there. Okay, now this is not a pinpoint price level to get in and get out of. That's where I think a lot of people go wrong, is they think that, because it's hit the trend line, it's got to bounce. And that's not a perfect science to it. So now that we've got that general idea of where price is holding, we can start to look for, in my opinion, levels like this one that give us a decent setup. Okay, so now we have something like here. And again, this is just a theoretical example. I'm just sharing one that looks really good so that we can kind of understand this concept. Know that it's not always going to be so perfect in the real markets, and you probably knew that already, but I just wanted to share so that people, people flame me in the comments all the time for that. They say, oh, it's a perfect example. I know it's perfectly created so that we can get an example out of this. But basically, as price comes down to this trend line, what we could do is we could look for a potential setup that gives us an edge in terms of risk to reward. So we could look for something that gives us something like a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 risk to reward. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say that we look for that pullback, and we've got a couple different factors here. We've got the supportive level that we mentioned, right? Previous levels of resistance here, now acting as potential support. And we've lined it up with that trend line that we looked at, right? Well, that gives us some sort of a potential kind of confluence of different technical factors that tell us, hey, there's a pretty good chance we could see some bullishness or some continuation here. Well, now we've got the pullback and we've got our trade. And let's say that we put a limit order to buy right around this previous level of support and where we could kind of line it up with that trend line. Well, that trend line is going to be acting again as a dynamic level of support. So we could probably assume that there's a pretty good chance that buyers in this area could look to hold their buy setup and actually push price off of this area to defend their long kind of bias or their long position. Well, if we put a stop just underneath the structure here, right? Well, we could put, let's put a structure there, right? We could give ourselves a 2-to-1. Well, in this case, it was a great little trade, right? We had a nice return to the recent structure high, broke through it just a little bit, actually saw a continued rally there before breaking down. And this is just one example of a trend line continuation setup. And that's what I really wanted to get to with this first kind of concept with trend lines, is we could be looking at this from the continuation standpoint, looking for trend side continuation pullback setups using trend lines. Now, the next one I'm going to show you is a little bit different, and it's actually the flip the script opposite of this sort of setup. Now we're going to be waiting patiently for a trend line level to be broken to trade the breakout. Okay. What I mean by this is, let's say that you have this trend line and we're watching it, right? Let's assume that you took the buy trade here and things went well, you took a profit there. And let's say that maybe you look for another pullback and this one wouldn't have actually worked, right? If we use this same setup, now we actually see price breaking down, and you see we would have probably gotten stopped out if we tried to take a trade there on the long side, right? So with that said, how could we trade the downside or the break of that trend line? A lot of times when you have a lot of bulls who are trying to buy into a market that's trending up, right? Well, when we start to see the break of that structure, then we see a big kind of push to the seller stepping in and pushing a market down after a major break. So as we come down, right, there might be a trade here as well. Now, we didn't quite get to it, but let's adjust our trend line just so we can show the example. Okay, let's say that you see something like this. You see a break underneath a trend line. And again, I know this is just an example, so bear with me, right? You have a price that breaks underneath that trend line, and now we start to see the retest of that trend line. And this is where the next kind of trade setup that I like comes from. As you break a trend line level of support and we see sellers step into a market and take it over, right? That's kind of like they're claiming their territory. They've broken through levels, and there's a pretty good chance they want to defend that new kind of territory that they've gained. So on a retest of that very same trend line, you can make a pretty good probability-based prediction that, hey, there's a pretty good chance here that sellers could step in and actually push this price down off of this level now. So now we have something like this, okay? Let's say that the price retests that trend line, and now we've broken it, and we're on the seller side. So now on the retest of that level, well, let's say that we put a little stop here, right? We keep our stop relatively tight. This is more of a counter trend because we've got a lot of trending to the upside overall, right? We're looking for something like a 2 or 3-to-1 here on the downside. In this case, it would have been a great trade, even if you had gone for a 3-to-1. Right, so have a nice little continuation to the downside. So this is just some examples, guys, of how I like to trade using trend lines. Trend line trading is one of my favorite ways, even though there's a little bit of kind of subjectivity to it, right? It's not a perfect science. All technical analysis to a degree has some subjectivity to it, unless you're using something like a simple moving average. There's a couple things that are mostly objective, but using them, in my opinion, how you use any sort of indicator or tool can be pretty subjective to a degree. So for me, what it means is using trend lines in a way that catches the most market participants and what they may be thinking. Remember, we drew kind of a line of best fit to kind of encompass the overall moves here that we're seeing in the market, right? So now there's two sort of setups that you can ask yourself, just recapping. You could trade with the trend line, a pullback to it, combine it with other factors, and look for the next leg of a trend. Or you can trade the break, which both of which I like both strategies, and I have strategies where, or accounts where I trade both of these concepts, primarily looking for either a continuation if I like the long side of things, or a breakout or a breakdown on the opposite side of it, right? Whether I'm long or short, this concept can be flipped. We could take a look at a downtrend line, right? Looking to see a break to the upside, right? There could be a breakout to the upside that sometimes you can catch on that kind of the opposite side of things as well. So just some things to think about with trend lines. I hope you got something out of today's video. If you did enjoy, do me a big favor, thumbs up down below and subscribe to the channel if you are new, and we'll be back next time with more content for you.